Chapter 18, Renewing Sectional Struggle. So this chapter covers, once again, only a short period of time. It's only about 6 years, from 1848 to 1854. So the Civil War starts early 1860s. You can see we're kind of looking at some of the causes, more or less, of the Civil War. So intro is talking about the year 1848. For all of you who are excited about European history, the year 1848 was a huge year in Europe. There was a lot of revolutions that happened. Of course, this is after the French Revolution, but there's a revolution in France, and that spreads to about 50 other countries in Europe. And while this doesn't have anything to do directly with the United States, the year 1848 was a huge year for the United States. There's definitely a lot of unrest in the United States. We ended the Mexican-American War, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but that sparks a lot of new problems. Okay, so yay, we won a war, but now the issue is, well, will this new territory we gained from this war, will it be slave or will it be free? That's the question. A lot of the Northerners didn't want slavery to spread, and they had rallied behind the Wilmot Proviso, which we talked about last chapter, which would have, had it been successfully passed, stopped the spread of slavery into this new land acquired by the Mexican-American War. And then, of course, though that proviso, the Wilmot Proviso, did not pass because those in the South were able to block it. So, although this provision didn't pass, the issue still remains. Is this new territory going to be slave or free? Yeah, and this issue of the expansion of slavery into the territories really threatened to split the political parties North and South. Dun, dun, dun. All right, first section, the popular sovereignty. Let's discuss popular sovereignty. Okay, so the two political parties had members both in the North and in the South. So there are Whigs that were in the North, and there are Whigs that are in the South. There are Democrats also in the North and in the South. So these two political parties were awesome. They're kind of like glue or staples or whatever you want to call that are holding the North and the South together. So it's great that these political parties have members in both areas because it's really kind of like glue holding the Union together. And as we might see at the end of this chapter, if the political parties had split, so like there would be a Northern political party and a Southern political party, that would have been disastrous for the Union. But for now, we're okay. Okay, so most politicians at this time really tried to ignore the issue of slavery because there are people in their political party that are both pro-slavery and against slavery. So most politicians, hoping to keep their job, really ignored this boiling pot, if you will, of slavery. So a lot of these political parties, politicians really tried to ignore this issue as long as possible. So we get the election of 1848, which just goes to show that these politicians are trying to ignore the issue of slavery. So the Democrats in 1848 decide not to re-nominate President Polk. In fact, President Polk decides not to run again because of some health issues, one of which your book tells us was chronic diarrhea. Oh, poor Polk. Okay, so Polk's not running again. So the Democrats have to find a new candidate. The Democrats decide to elect to nominate General Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass has a lot of experience. He's a diplomat. He was a senator. He had been in the War of 1812. So they really put him forth. The Democrats are putting up General Lewis Cass. And he is, on paper he looks good, but really to the American people, he seems very pompous, really full of himself, thinking himself better than others. So perhaps not the best personality ever. And the Democratic Party in the election of 1848, really kept quiet about the issue of slavery. So their official platform remember the platform is kind of a list of what they stand for, is kind of hush-hush on the issue of slavery. However, General Cass himself is not so quiet about this issue of slavery. General Cass really put forth this notion of popular sovereignty. You would remember this because that's what this section's talking about, a popular sovereignty. So what is popular sovereignty? Well, it's the idea that new territories, when they're applying to become states, or when they become states, it's the people within the states that get to decide if they want slavery or not. So the issue of slavery ceases being a federal issue and becomes more of like a local issue. So a lot of people liked it. A lot of Americans liked it because frankly we like democracy, and it seems very democratic to have the people who are living in these territories or in these states decide for themselves. So this is an idea General Cass really puts forth as a way to kind of solve the issue of slavery. Yeah, and a lot of politicians really kind of rally behind this idea of popular sovereignty because, like I said, it's kind of like a compromise. So you don't have to be a person who's goes so far as to forbidding slavery or go so far as to protect slavery. You can kind of sit on the fence in the middle if you say, I'm for popular sovereignty. Smile and nod, okay? And because if you are for popular sovereignty, it kind of allows you to push the issue of slavery into the states and off your back. You're like, well, I think the states should figure that out for themselves. Wonderful. Okay, next section, section B, political triumphs for General Taylor. So we're still talking about the election of 1848. So General Taylor is actually the nominee of the Whigs. So, in 1848, the Whigs indeed, not surprisingly, nominate Zachary Taylor. He had been a war hero, remember the hero of Buena Vista in the Mexican-American War. And he really wasn't a politician, and perhaps the Whigs should have nominated Henry Clay, because Henry Clay is really like the voice of the Whig Party, kind of embodies the Whig Party. But alas, Henry Clay had just too many enemies. So they decide, the Whigs once again, they have a good kind of track record with war heroes, so they put forth General Zachary Taylor. And once again, the Whigs also kind of ignored the big issues in their platform, so they didn't really talk about slavery in their platform. They instead really highlighted the virtues of General Zachary Taylor. And, you know, Zachary Taylor had not made an official stance on slavery, but he did actually own slaves. He's a Louisiana plantation owner. So Zachary Taylor, while he didn't have an official position on slavery, he did actually own slaves. So, yeah. So, like we said, we have the Democrats putting forth Cass. We have the Whigs putting forth Zachary Taylor. But in this election, another third party starts to develop. And this party is called the Free Soil Party. Okay, the Free Soil Party are people who think that we should not let slavery expand into these new territories. So Free Soil Party doesn't want the expansion of slavery. And it's not because of a moral issue necessarily against slavery. It's more of an economic issue against slavery. They think that these new territories should be kept free from slavery in order to allow whites more opportunity. Right, so if there's no slavery to compete with, allows whites to have a better chance at gaining jobs, gaining land, that sort of thing. Yes. All right, and so this free soil party, that's the gist of it, but they attract a lot of different, kind of a mixed bag of different people. The industrialists that were mad at Polk's lower tariff kind of went into the Free Soil Party. Democrats mad at Polk for settling and compromising in Oregon, why he didn't compromise in Texas. They were also kind of into this Free Soil Party. Because remember, when it came to Oregon, the Oregon Territory being obviously north, then being a free territory, remember that Polk had kind of settled that. He settled at the 49th parallel instead of getting that full territory a lot of people wanted. But when it came to Texas, he didn't settle at all, President Polk. And that really suggested to some people that it was kind of unfair to the North, because the North was free and they kind of got gypped out of all the territory they wanted, but the South, being a slave state, or Texas being a slave state, they got all the territory they wanted. So people were kind of ticked off with that, so they went into the Free Soil Party. Other people in the Free Soil Party, like I said, a lot of them were Northerners who just didn't want to share this new territory with slave owners. And there were some, the conscience Whigs, those Whigs who really opposed slavery for moral reasons. But in general, the Free Soilers, their stance was, we don't want slavery to expand into these new territories, not for moral reasons, but for economic reasons. And so they nominate as their candidate in 1848 former President Van Buren. So in the end, in 1848, the Whigs come off on top. So we have now President General Zachary Taylor is now president, and they win, I think, 163 to 127 in the Electoral College. Good for you, General Taylor. All right, switching gears now. Okay, California gold. California gold. Okay, so we're talking about the gold rush. Hooray! So, a lot of, like we said before this time, a lot of politicians were really hush-hush on the issue of slavery. Even in the election of 1848, it was really more of an election about the personalities of the candidate as opposed to any big political or social issue. But the lid on the boiling pot of slavery is blown off when it comes to the issue of California. Okay, so gold is discovered in 1848 near Sutner's Mill in California. So in this Sierra Nevada mountains of California, gold is discovered. So gold fever sets in. Gold fever is setting in, and people pour into California hoping to strike it rich. A few folks do strike it rich, but a few is not everybody, okay? And most really would have been better off financially had they stayed at home. But still, that allure of get rich quick was there. So tens of thousands of Americans flood into California. And, some people made money by mining the miners. So they would charge just outrageous fees for like everyday goods, outrageous fees for laundry, that sort of thing. And some people who were kind of over it, they couldn't find any gold in California, actually went other places. They went to, for example, Australia to try to find gold. All of this I'm just kind of randomly throwing at you. Anyway, so this rush of, or flood of Americans into California looking for gold is of course called the California Gold Rush. And here's the problem, okay? California, we've just purchased it, or we just got hold of it after this Mexican-American War, so it wasn't even technically a territory yet. So with this huge influx of of Americans, influx of people in California, their system of government was completely overwhelmed. So a lot of these folks that were in California were very lawless. The women were virtueless women. Okay, so a lot of kind of rough people in California, and this really led to kind of an outburst in crime. So robbery and murder were common. A lot of vigilante justice, which means kind of like taking the law into your own hands. So if somebody steals your mine or something to the effect, you might just shoot them in the back, that sort of thing. So it was really kind of this lawless area. So California, wanting to kind of get a hold of the situation decides to apply directly for statehood, which would then actually skip the process of becoming a territory. So the state of California, hoping to kind of get control over California again, I should say the area of California, they applied directly for statehood, skipping this territory step. The problem was, when they created this Constitution of California, they decided that they wanted to be a free state. Ooh, this is going to cause some issues here. The Southern politicians were very, very much alarmed that California might actually be able to enter as a free state, because that would upset the balance in the Senate. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, next section. Sectional balance and the Underground Railroad. Okay, so in 1850, things are looking pretty good for the South. Okay, remember the South had a strong tradition of having some very apt, very excellent politicians. So President Zachary Taylor, like we mentioned, was actually from Louisiana. He was a slaveholder. So we had a Southerner who was president. Most of the cabinet and most of the Supreme Court were also from the South. While it was true the South was outnumbered in the House of Representatives, they had a balance, or they was equaled out in the Senate. So there's 15 slave states, 15 free states. So they did have kind of a balance in the Senate, and that allowed the South to prevent any unwanted measures to be passed. And it also allowed them to be able to veto any amendments that might pass. So say, the North got their act together and produced an amendment to the Constitution prohibiting slavery. Well, because there was a balance in the Senate, the South could have been able to veto it. All right, so also the cotton fields, they kept expanding. The price of cotton was nice and high. The South was loving it. And really, although the issue was now, will slavery be able to expand west, there wasn't really any feeling, or anyone really seriously thought that slavery in the South was at risk at all. The issue was more about expanding west. The issue wasn't ever about, will slavery disappear in the South? So, anyway. Yet, the South was still worried. We had all these good things going for the South, but they were very, very worried, and it was especially about California entering as a free state. So California enters as a free state. Now the South loses the balance they had in the Senate, because now there'll be 16 free states and only 15 slave states. So this issue of California really, really kind of worries the South. Also, the territories of New Mexico and Utah, which we had also gotten from the Mexican-American War, there had been talk that they would enter as a free state if they had the choice of popular sovereignty, meaning that they got to choose for themselves if they got to be free or slave. The kind of the general idea was, or thought was, rumor was going around, that New Mexico and Utah would become free states if they were allowed the popular sovereignty. So there was other issues going on too. You can look at a map on page 421. This could be helpful. Because another thing in dispute was there is a region in modern-day New Mexico that Texas was claiming as a part of their state. So remember, Texas is definitely a slave state, and New Mexico, it is thought, will probably enter as a free state. So there's a chunk of New Mexico that Texas is actually claiming as a part of their state that's in dispute at this time. And this is really becomes quite explosive, this kind of issue of this chunk of New Mexico that Texas is claiming. Other things kind of worrying the South, Northern abolitionists keep nagging to get the capital in Washington, D.C., to get that to be a free territory, so no slavery in D.C., so a lot of abolitionists in the North are kind of working towards that. And the South is losing slaves through something called the Underground Railroad. So let's talk about the Underground Railroad. Why not? So think of a railroad. There's this analogy of a railroad. There's kind of three different parts. Okay, we have the stations, like a railroad station. We have passengers. We have conductors on this Underground Railroad. So stations, in this analogy, would equate to homes where the slaves would hide. So they'd run from kind of one home to the next, one station to the next on this Underground Railroad. And their hope was to move from slave states, or where they lived, and get all the way up north into Canada, which was free. Because remember, Canada was owned by Britain, and Britain had outlawed slavery. So the idea was to get not all, but to get the slaves from the south all the way north into Canada, where they would be guaranteed their freedom. So we have the stations, we have the passengers, which are of course the runaway slaves themselves, and then we had conductors, who are both black and white abolitionists that were helping this process along. The biggest name we get out of the Underground Railroad is the most famous conductor of all, Harriet Tubman. All right, Harriet Tubman was a runaway slave herself, and she made over 19 trips back into the South to rescue it's estimated, about 300 slaves. So she would constantly risk her own life, her own freedom. She'd make 19 trips back to the South, then bringing with her more slaves to freedom in Canada. So she actually freed over 300 slaves. And because of this role of kind of leading slaves into freedom, she's called, the Moses. Like Moses, Israelites, leading them from Egypt to Canaan, the Promised Land. Well, hey, nothing like the Bible in American history. Okay, so the Southerners in 1850 were over this, okay, and they demanded it be stopped. Before, there had been a Fugitive Slave Law. It was passed in 1793, but really it wasn't being enforced. So the Southerners are now demanding a more, strict or a more severe fugitive slave law. And the thing was, these Northerners really didn't see this as stealing. So they really didn't see, these slaves trying to escape for their freedom as stealing. It's not like the conductors were keeping the slaves for themselves. So like I said, it really wasn't enforced. And only about 1,000 runaways actually made it each year. So really the number of escaped slaves wasn't that great. Actually, more slaves got their freedom through purchasing it than actually running away themselves. But still, it was in the South, it was the principle of the thing, right? They're like, well, this law is on the books. They thought slavery was protected by the Constitution, and they thought this should be enforced, right? So slavery is constitutional. We have a law here, this Fugitive Slave Law. It ought to be enforced. So it was more of kind of the principle of the thing than it was actually the loss of slaves in the long run. Yes, and with that, I think we will be done with this video.